In a prisoner of war camp near Reims, 1944, the days were measured by orders and by the click of the flag rope against the guard tower. Among the German sentries, Eric was quiet, obedient, and weary of the endless frost. Among the American prisoners, Thomas kept a crust of bread from breakfast tucked inside his coat. When that bread slipped to the frozen ground between them, Eric picked it up and set it back on the fence, an act small enough to go unseen, large enough to be remembered. The next day, half a loaf returned with a strip of dried meat. Later, a note appeared inside. "Thank you. We'll remember your face." Their exchange, wordless but human, continued beneath the snow and the rules that tried to silence it. During an alarm, a stray bullet struck the bread in Thomas's pocket, sparing his life. Years later, the two men met again in a cafe beside where the fence once stood. Behind them, in a small museum case, a hardened loaf rested, quiet proof that compassion had once crossed the wire. The snow had been falling since dawn, settling into every seam of the fence. Beyond it, the world was white and still broken only by a cough from the barracks and the dull hum of a generator that never quite warmed the air. Orders moved faster than warmth. "No soldiers are to speak across the fence." The commandant's voice cut through the air like a file on steel. Eric Bauer stood by the loudspeaker post, his breath fogging the rim of his scarf. He nodded as if obedience could render him unseen. Beside him, Otto stamped his boots for heat, and Franz let his rifle trace idle patterns in the snow. They were guards, yes, but mostly men waiting for spring. Across the wire, two American prisoners, Thomas Hale and the younger one, Louis, sat on overturned bucket sleeves rolled high on their thin arms. They pretended not to hear the order. Rules had become part of the weather. Everyone followed them until defiance felt like mercy. A crust of bread slipped from Thomas's pocket and landed in the drift. He bent, but the wire reached lower than he could. Eric watched the small shape darken in the snow, then stepped forward. The regulation said nothing about bread. He crouched, brushed away the ice, and lifted it. The loaf was half-hard, the color of earth. For a moment he weighed it in his gloved hand as if it might reveal the right decision. "Leave it," Otto muttered. "Protocol." Eric looked at him, then at the fence. The Americans were watching. He placed the loaf on the middle strand of wire and stepped back. The gesture was small enough to be overlooked, large enough to be remembered. Wind sighed through the posts, carrying the smell of coal smoke and something faintly sweet, the scent of the bread itself. No one moved to claim it. Thomas raised his eyes briefly, not in gratitude, not yet, but in recognition. Across the field, the same snow covered both sides. Franz turned away first. He had the look of someone refusing to notice mercy. The rule was safe again, but thinner now, like ice over running water. Eric stood still, hands folded behind his back, pretending to study the horizon. Inside he felt a quiet tremor, the way a man might feel when a hymn begins before he remembers the words. The fence quivered under another gust, its wires humming a note that no one had written. Louis whispered something that vanished in the cold. Eric couldn't hear it, but he knew what silence between men could carry. He watched the bread tilt balance stay. Snow settled on it until it was indistinguishable from the fence itself. Somewhere down the line a bell rang, the signal for evening count. Eric turned with the others, boots crunching in rhythm uniforms gray with frost. Behind him the bread waited a small defiance against the order of war. They said no soldiers were to speak across the fence, but the fence listened. The morning came without color. A gray sky pressed low over the camp, and the fence cut the horizon into two pale halves. Smoke from the kitchen drifted between them, thin, weak, like a memory of warmth. Eric and Otto walked, their patrol rifles slung without purpose. They had long stopped watching for escape attempts. Hunger had become its own kind of prison. On the other side, Thomas and Louis crouched near the line, their jackets patched with old letters and Red Cross cloth. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee from the guard hut. When Eric passed the same spot where the bread had rested, he found only a stain of crumbs on the wire. The loaf was gone. He didn't ask. Some rules were easier to obey by pretending they no longer applied. At midday, a small sound, a scrape of metal on metal, made him look up. Across the fence, Thomas was holding half a loaf of something fresher steam, curling faintly in the cold. He hesitated, then eased it onto the middle wire and gave a nervous grin. "Guess we bake it the same way, huh?" Eric didn't move. Otto beside him let out a dry laugh that fogged into the gray air. Maybe, Otto said, but ours last longer. He stepped forward, pulled a strip of dried meat from his pocket, and set it on the bread. Then, quick as the act itself, he pushed it back toward the Americans. The exchange took no more than 5 seconds, but in that small trade, the fence seemed to lose its purpose. Thomas looked at the offering, then nodded once. He tore the bread in half again, gave a piece to Louis, and the two of them ate slowly, like men tasting peace for the first time. The guards said nothing. Eric watched the snow gather on the wire where the food had passed. A simple act, and yet his chest felt lighter, as if something had been quietly returned to him. For a long minute no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of snow falling onto the metal strands. Behind them, boots crunched on gravel, the patrol returning. Otto straightened, pretending to adjust his belt. Thomas tucked the last crumb into his coat. The lieutenant passed without looking their way. Rules stayed intact because no one had the courage to see they'd been broken. When the echo of footsteps faded, Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced once more at the fence. The snow had covered their traces, but not fast enough to erase the warmth in the air between them. War was still everywhere, above, below, all around, but for a moment it had been divided in half like the bread itself. Bread crossed the fence before any bullet ever did. Night fell early that winter, as if the sun had grown tired of watching men repeat the same mistakes. A weak lamp swung above the guard table, its light trembling each time the wind slipped through the seams of the barrack. Somewhere in the distance, a radio whispered an American jazz tune, soft and grainy. Eric sat beside the small stove, rubbing his hands together for warmth that refused to come. Otto had gone to file reports, and Franz was pretending to sleep. Outside, the snow shifted in thin gusts. The day's patrol had ended without incident, which was another word for nothing human happening. When he stepped outside for air, a shadow near the fence caught his eye. A bundle the size of a loaf rested against the lowest strand of wire half buried in snow. He looked around. The yard was empty. He reached down, fingers stiff inside his gloves, and lifted it. It was bread again, heavier this time. Inside the hut, he set it on the table. The crust had been sliced open and pressed back together. Cautious, he pulled it apart. A strip of paper lay inside, folded small as a prayer. The handwriting was rough letters, uneven as though written in the dark. "Thank you. We'll remember your face." Eric read it twice, then a third time, as if meaning might change with repetition. He felt his throat tighten, a slow ache that wasn't quite sadness. Franz stirred in his bunk and sat up. "What is it?" Eric hesitated before showing him the note. The younger man blinked, frowned. "You think command would call that treason?" Eric looked at the fence through the frosted window. The wire glimmered under the moon like the edge of a blade. Maybe, he said quietly, but not in every language. Franz turned back to his blanket, muttering about reports and orders, but his voice held less conviction than usual. The radio crackled again, a trumpet fighting its way through static, then died mid-note. The room fell into that kind of silence that belongs only to winter nights and unspoken truths. Eric folded the scrap of paper carefully, the way a man folds a flag. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his uniform, close to where his dog tag rested. He stared at the stove, the last coal dimming to ember. For a moment he imagined the men across the fence, huddled near their own fading fire, the same frost in their breath, the same ache in their stomachs. Two sides of the same hunger. He stood and stepped to the door, listening. The wind dragged across the wire, making it hum a low, uncertain note. Somewhere beyond that sound, he thought he heard a laugh, one of theirs, or maybe his own memory of laughter. He closed the door softly. The room felt smaller now, but somehow warmer. Eric sat again, hands still. He didn't need to look at the paper anymore. The words were already written into the silence. Outside, the snow kept falling slow and patient, erasing footprints, softening the fence until it looked almost kind. Still, they kept passing bread. The morning began with sirens. They cut through the mist like saw teeth, shrill and panicked, bouncing off the walls of the camp. Men spilled from the barracks, half-dressed, eyes wide. Even the snow seemed startled, shaking loose from the roofs in thin sheets. Eric ran to his post by the fence boots, punching deep holes in the drift. Beyond the wire, a handful of prisoners were being counted again and again. One name short, one body missing. "Check the far yard," the lieutenant barked. "He can't have gone far." Otto swung his rifle to his shoulder, out of habit, not hatred. Eric's hands went cold around his own weapon, though the metal burned to the touch. They moved down the line, hearts thudding to a rhythm older than orders. Then a shadow broke from the far side, someone running, coat flapping like torn wings. The air went tight. The lieutenant shouted, "Halt!" A shot cracked. Time fractured into light and noise. The bullet struck something and spat a small puff of brown dust. No blood, no cry, only a dull thud and a body collapsing into snow. Eric froze. Otto lowered his weapon halfway, staring. The runner, Thomas, lay still, then shifted, clutching his chest. His coat tore open, revealing crumbs and the torn remains of a loaf tucked inside his shirt. The bread had stopped the round embedded deep in its crust. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The sirens kept screaming, but they sounded far away now, like a memory replaying on broken film. Otto whispered, "It didn't go through." Eric stepped forward. No, it didn't. Their eyes met, one guard, one friend by accident, and in that look sat 1,000 letters never written. The fence between them seemed to fade as though mercy itself had drawn breath. The lieutenant approached, saw the scene, and said nothing. He glanced at the unspent shell, the loaf still smoking where it had caught the bullet, and turned away. Some rules could not survive the evidence of their own failure. Eric crouched. "Stay still," he murmured, voice rough. Thomas blinked, dazed, snow melting in his hair. "Was it?" Thomas began. Eric shook his head. "Bread," he said simply. "Just bread." Thomas managed a broken smile. "Good thing we kept sharing it." Eric wanted to answer, but words would have turned the moment smaller than it was. He only nodded once, slow and deliberate, a salute meant for both sides. Otto looked at the hole in the fence, then at the bread in Thomas's hands. "It's not supposed to stop a bullet," he muttered. Eric's voice was quiet. Maybe it wasn't the bread that did. The wind shifted, carrying away the smoke. The snow began again, soft flakes drifting through the gap, settling on metal, on shoulders, on the still warm crust of bread. The alarm silenced itself, one echo at a time, until only the hum of the fence remained. No one wrote reports that day. No punishments were issued. The story passed instead in silence, from guard to prisoner, from man to man. And somewhere inside that silence, a truth settled like falling snow. The bread had stopped more than one kind of bullet. The radio played low in the corner, its static folding into the smell of coffee and rain. The voice on air was calm, older, wrapped in the kind of warmth that only distance gives, back when the war still had no name for mercy. The cafe was small, one of those Midwestern places where the walls carried photographs instead of decorations. Behind the counter hung a picture in sepia, 2 men, a fence, and a loaf of bread balanced between them. The glass had clouded with years, but the story still shone through. Eric Bauer sat near the window, coat draped over his chair hair, white as the frost on the pane. Across from him, Thomas Hale stirred his cup, the spoon clicking gently. They had found each other by accident, or maybe by something more deliberate than luck. Thomas spoke first. "You gave me half your bread," he said, smiling at the steam rising from his coffee. Eric's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his own cup. "And you gave me back a whole life." They both laughed quietly, as if the sound itself might break the spell of the morning. A waitress refilled their mugs, glancing from one to the other, not sure whether to interrupt or simply listen. Outside, the world had changed its uniforms. Cars replaced tanks, and the fences were now made of pickets instead of wire. But in the quiet between sips, they both heard echoes of the same wind that once carried snow through rhymes. "Strange, isn't it?" Thomas said. "We never wrote each other. I figured that made it more honest." Eric nodded. "Some things are better left unwritten. They live longer that way." From the radio came another voice, younger this time, the host introducing a segment about local veterans. The sound mingled with the hiss of the coffee pot. In the pause between sentences, they could almost hear the faint hum of wire stretched across winter fields. At the far end of the cafe, a young waitress leaned over the counter, staring at the old photograph. "That really happened?" she asked. The man behind the counter wiped his hands on a towel, smiling. "They say it did right behind this cafe, back when the road was just dirt." Eric looked up at that eyes, tracing the wall, the memories tucked between the wooden frames. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small paper envelope. Inside lay a fragment of bread gray and hard as stone. "Kept it all these years," he said softly. "It's not much to look at now." Thomas leaned forward. "Neither are we," he said, and they both laughed again. Outside, rain turned to drizzle, tapping against the glass like a familiar rhythm. People walked past without noticing the two men by the window or the tiny relic resting on the table between them. But for a moment the cafe felt like a kind of chapel. No prayers, no anthems, just two men who had once met at the edge of a rule and found something holier than victory. The waitress reached for her camera. "Mind if I take a photo?" Eric straightened, smoothing his coat. Thomas lifted his cup eyes, crinkling. The shutter clicked. The laughter that followed drifted through the cafe, gentle and fading, like the last note of an old song still echoing in the air long after the music stopped. Then someone took a photo. The museum smelled faintly of waxed floors and old wood, the kind of quiet that carried its own history. Morning light streamed through the high windows, catching dust in mid-air like snow that had forgotten how to fall. In the center of the small exhibit stood a glass case. Nothing ornate, just a square of light holding a single object, a loaf of bread cracked and gray with age. Its crust had hardened into stone, but under the glass it still looked warm somehow, as if the memory of hands had kept it alive. A brass plaque at the base read, "In memory of the soldiers who shared bread across the fence, 1944. Visitors shuffled through murmuring cameras, whispering clicks that faded quickly into the air. At the edge of the group, a boy of 10 tugged at his father's sleeve. They were enemies, he asked. The guide, an older woman with a badge that read Veterans Museum. Reims. Chapter smiled gently. Once she said, but the bread remembered better than they did. The boy stared at the loaf for a long time, the reflection of the glass turning his face into a ghost beside it. His father placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded toward the next display, but the boy didn't move. Somewhere in the corner, a faint sound came from an old radio built into the wall exhibit. It played a recording of two voices barely audible through static laughter, an accent caught between German and American, then silence. The click that followed felt like the end of a long sentence that had finally earned its period. Outside, church bells began to ring their echoes, drifting through the open door of the museum. A gust of autumn wind stirred the flags at the entrance, their colors bright against the pale morning. A group of veterans stood by the window, coffee cups in hand, looking out toward the square. One of them wore a faded jacket with a patch stitched carefully on the sleeve, a small loaf of bread embroidered in gold thread. He said something to the others, and they nodded. None of them needed to look at the display again. The guide returned to the glass case and adjusted the light slightly so it hit the bread just right, soft, warm like sunrise after snow. This was found in 1975, she told the visitors, kept by one of the men who met here after the war. He said it wasn't about hunger, it was about being seen. A teacher whispered to her students, "That's the hardest kind of kindness when no one's watching." The boy turned from the case at last, holding that sentence as if it were something small and bright. As the crowd moved on, the room grew still again. The radio crackled once, then stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent, like the pause between breaths before someone says, "Thank you." Sunlight shifted, warming the glass until the loaf glowed faintly. Beyond the window, children's voices echoed from the courtyard, alive, unguarded, free. The plaque gleamed one last time in the moving light. The words were simple, but they held the weight of everything that mattered. In memory of the soldiers who shared bread across the fence, 1944. He didn't win the war, he won something harder. The bread sits behind glass now, the crust pale beneath a slow circle of light. Visitors drift past their reflections, merging with the story inside. Somewhere a radio hums the same hymn once heard through snow. Its static softer, but the message unchanged. Kindness never asked for change. It only asked to be seen. The loaf catches the morning sun like a canteen cup, filling with light proof that mercy can outlast memory. For a moment, silence feels like applause. He didn't win the war. He won something harder.